Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we step quietly into an Arctic night that does not care who you are or how confident you feel. You stand where the air itself feels heavier, sharper, as if it has edges. The sky is dark long before your body is ready for it. Your breath leaves you in pale clouds that drift away without urgency. Snow creaks underfoot with a sound that feels louder than it should. You probably will not survive this if you arrive unprepared. And that is not drama, just a calm observation delivered early so you understand the stakes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights. You do not rush forward. The cold discourages haste. Every movement has a cost here, and your body senses that immediately. Fingers stiffen first, then toes. Muscles tighten, not from effort but from restraint. You learn quickly that warmth is not something you gain by action alone. It is something you protect by avoiding unnecessary loss. This is the first lesson the Arctic teaches, and it arrives before any shelter appears. A mainstream historical fact often mentioned by archaeologists is that Arctic indigenous groups lived in regions where winter temperatures regularly dropped far below what most humans can tolerate without specialized adaptation. This was not a rare emergency. It was the baseline. Life continued through nights that lasted for months, not hours. Knowing that changes how you stand here now. You realize this is not a story about endurance as a dramatic event. It is about endurance as routine. You feel the cold working its way inward, testing gaps in clothing, posture, even thought. Breathing through your mouth stings. Inhaling through your nose warms the air slightly enough to matter. You begin to copy the way others move. Chin tucked, shoulders relaxed, arms close to the body. Nothing flails, nothing wastes heat. The cold rewards stillness more than strength. There is a quirky detail that surprises many people when they first learn about Arctic survival. In extreme cold, sweating can be more dangerous than freezing air. Moisture trapped in clothing steals heat fast. That means working too hard can be just as risky as doing nothing at all. So you move carefully, deliberately, as if pacing yourself for a night that will not end quickly. The darkness feels different here. It is not dramatic. It is thorough. The horizon disappears. Snow reflects faint starlight, giving the ground a soft glow that feels almost deceptive. You might think this makes things easier, but it also blurs distance and depth. Without landmarks, direction becomes a memory rather than a visible fact. You understand why Arctic peoples relied so heavily on familiarity and repetition. You go where you know, not where you guess. Your body begins rewriting its priorities. Hunger fades into the background. Thirst becomes quiet but persistent. Warmth dominates everything. Even your thoughts slow condensing around simple evaluations. Is the wind stronger than before? Is your face numb or painful? Can you still feel your fingers when you press them together? Each question matters more than whatever plans brought you here. Some scholars still debate whether humans psychologically adapt to cold environments over generations, or whether behavior alone accounts for Arctic survival. There is no clean answer. What you feel now suggests it is not just technique. It is expectation. No one here is surprised by the cold. Fear drains energy. Familiarity conserves it. Sound behaves oddly. Wind scrapes across snow, but it does not roar unless it has a reason. Your own movements sound amplified, every footstep an announcement. Voices are low, not out of fear but efficiency. Loud speech wastes breath. Breath is heat. Heat is life. You begin to understand why silence becomes a habit rather than a rule. The night presses against your face, your ears, your eyes. Eyelashes collect frost, blinking slowly keeps them from sticking together. You might laugh quietly at that, the absurdity of freezing eyelashes, but humour serves a purpose here. It reminds you that awareness beats panic. Panic burns fuel you cannot afford. You notice how the people around you seem unbothered, not comfortable but composed. They have seen this night before many times. They know it will not escalate without warning. The Arctic rarely surprises those who listen closely. The danger comes when you ignore small signals. A shifting wind, a sudden quiet, a change in how snow moves across the ground. You feel your sense of time stretching. Minutes feel longer. Not because you're bored, but because you're alert. Every moment carries information. The cold makes you attentive in a way modern life rarely does. You're fully present not by choice, but necessity. Another mainstream detail that often appears in historical accounts is that survival depended less on heroic action and more on avoiding mistakes. People did not test limits for sport. They stayed well inside what they knew worked. That mindset shapes everything you are about to experience. Risk is not admired here. Consistency is. You begin to realize that shelter when it comes will not feel like rescue. It will feel like continuation. The night does not end when you step inside. It simply changes texture. Outside, the cold is open and immediate. Inside, it becomes something you manage, negotiate, and outlast. As you stand there, breath, slow muscles, conserving heat, you understand that the Arctic night is not something you defeat. It is something you live alongside. The people who survived these coldest nights did not conquer the environment. They learned how to move within it without drawing its attention. The cold keeps pressing, but you are no longer startled by it. You have adjusted your stance, your breathing, your expectations. This is how survival begins here. Not with shelter, not with fire, but with awareness. And as you take one careful step forward, the night allows it. You do not learn winter by being told about it. You learn it by noticing what happens before it fully arrives. That understanding begins long before the coldest nights press down on the land. You feel it now in the way people pause, more often scanning the horizon, even when nothing obvious changes. The Arctic teaches patience first, not strength. The air carries information if you pay attention. It's not just temperature, it is weight. Dry air feels sharper in your lungs, moist air feels heavier, even before snow appears. You notice how elders lift a hand sniff once and adjust what they are doing without explanation. No announcement follows. No warning is spoken aloud. Preparation begins quietly. One widely accepted historical observation is that Arctic communities relied on deep environmental literacy rather than written forecasts or instruments. Long before modern meteorology, people recognized patterns in wind direction, cloud height, and animal behavior that signaled coming cold. This knowledge was not abstract, it was a practical, immediate, and constantly tested. When it failed, consequences arrived quickly. You begin to notice the animals. Birds shift their routes earlier than expected. Seals linger near breathing holes for longer stretches. Even dogs behave differently, curling tighter, conserving energy. These changes are not dramatic, but they are consistent. When patterns repeat, they become warnings. You realize that survival here depends on noticing small shifts before they become emergencies. A quirky detail preserved in some oral traditions suggests that certain Arctic hunters could predict severe cold by the way snow sounded underfoot days in advance. Dry snow squeaks. Wetter snow crunches. A gradual change in sound hinted at dropping humidity and rising cold. It sounds almost poetic, but it is rooted in physical reality. Snow structure changes with temperature and moisture. Your ears become tools. You feel how routines start adjusting subtly. Tasks are completed earlier in the day. Movements slow not because of laziness, but conservation. Tools are checked twice. Repairs happen, even if nothing looks broken. You sense a collective agreement forming without words. Winter is tightening its grip. The response is calm, not frantic. Historians still argue whether this kind of anticipatory behavior should be classified as instinct or learned skill. The debate remains open because it likely sits somewhere in between. Children grow up surrounded by these patterns. They absorb responses long before they understand the reasons. By adulthood, preparation feels natural, almost automatic. The sky plays its part. Low clouds moving quickly suggest wind. High thin clouds often mean colder nights ahead. A clear sky might look peaceful, but it can signal dangerous temperature drops after sunset. You feel the tension between beauty and threat. The Arctic rarely announces danger loudly. It prefers understatement. You notice how stories are told during this time, not as entertainment but as reminders. Someone recalls a winter when travel was delayed one day too long. Another mentions a shelter repaired just in time. These are not dramatic tales. They are cautionary echoes. The message is subtle but clear. Prepare early. Assume the night will be worse than yesterday. Food preparation shifts too. High-fat reserves are prioritized. Fresh meat is stored carefully. Nothing is wasted. This is not about scarcity alone. It is about efficiency. Fat burns slowly in the body, producing sustained heat through long nights. You begin to understand that diet here is not cultural preference. It is thermal strategy. Another mainstream fact often noted by anthropologists is that Arctic peoples schedule travel and hunting around weather cycles rather than fixed calendars. Time was flexible, weather was not. You move when conditions allow, not when plans demand. That flexibility saves lives. You feel your own expectations changing. You stop asking how cold it will get and start asking how long the cold will last. Duration matters more than intensity. A brief extreme can be endured. A long moderate cold demands discipline. This shift in thinking feels subtle, but it changes everything. There is an odd calm that settles in once preparation is underway. Anxiety fades when action replaces uncertainty. You see this reflected in faces around you. No one looks excited, no one looks afraid, they look focused. Preparedness is comforting in its own way. You also notice what does not happen. There is no last-minute scramble, no dramatic packing. Everything needed for the night is already nearby. This is deliberate. Scrambling wastes heat and attention. You learn that readiness is built into daily life, not added at the end. Some scholars still debate how much of this predictive knowledge was shared explicitly versus absorbed through observation. There were no formal lessons, no manuals. Children watched. They imitated. Correction came gently, often without words. Over time, mistakes became rare because the environment itself enforced learning. The wind shifts slightly, almost imperceptibly. Someone adjusts a hood without comment. Another tightens a tie on their clothing. These movements ripple quietly through the group. Preparation spreads like warmth, uneven but effective. As night approaches, you realize that survival here does not begin at sunset. It begins days earlier, sometimes weeks. The coldest nights are endured not through last-minute effort, but through a series of small, correct choices made consistently. You take a breath and feel less exposed than before, not because the air is warmer, but because you're no longer guessing. You're reading the same signs as everyone else. The Arctic still holds the advantage, but it has revealed enough for you to respond. And with that understanding settling into your body, you move forward already prepared for a night that has not fully arrived yet. The land does not introduce itself gently. It does not pause to see if you are ready. It simply exists solid and indifferent and expects you to adjust. You feel that now as you move across ground that offers no softness, no forgiveness. Snow hides uneven ice. Ice hides open water. Nothing here is decorative. Everything has consequences. You begin to understand that the Arctic landscape is not a backdrop. It is an active participant. Hills redirect wind. Valleys trap cold air like bowls. Coastlines invite sudden weather shifts without warning. The land teaches by reaction. If you misread it, the lesson arrives quickly and without commentary. One widely accepted historical fact is that Arctic communities developed survival strategies that were deeply local. Techniques that worked in one region could fail dangerously in another only a short distance away. Snow behaves differently near the sea than inland. Ice thickens unevenly depending on currents. Knowing the land meant knowing your land, not the Arctic, as an abstract idea. You feel how movement becomes cautious, not because of fear, but respect. Each step is tested. Weight shifts slowly. You do not trust the surface just because it looks solid. Experience has taught others here that appearances are unreliable. Snow can support you one moment and swallow your leg the next. Ice can hold for days, then crack silently beneath familiar roots. A curious and lesser-known detail recorded in some early accounts is that experienced travellers could sense unsafe ice through vibration felt there in the soles of their boots, subtle almost imagined. A faint difference in how sound travels upward through the body. Whether this was true sensitivity or learned intuition remains debated, but many stories repeat the claim. Either way, people listen to their feet as much as their eyes. The land shapes behaviour even when you are not moving. Shelters are placed with intention, not where the view is best, but where wind will be broken naturally. A low rise can mean the difference between manageable cold and constant exposure. Snowdrifts are not random. They follow patterns carved by terrain. Knowing where a snow will pile up helps you know where it will insulate and where it will scour down to ice. Historians still argue whether Arctic survival knowledge should be classified as environmental mastery or environmental partnership. Some emphasize control, pointing to engineered shelters and tools. Others suggest a more cooperative relationship where survival depends on working with natural patterns rather than imposing order. Standing here, it feels closer to partnership. The land sets terms, you respond intelligently or suffer. You notice that no one lingers in open spaces longer than necessary. Wide areas invite wind. Narrow paths offer shelter. Routes curve not because they are inefficient, but because they follow safer contours. Efficiency here is measured in warmth retained, not distance saved. Sound carries strangely across the landscape. Distant crack might be ice shifting miles away or dangerously close. You learn not to assume scale. The land distorts perception. This is why familiarity matters more than maps. You trust places you have survived before. Unknown terrain is approached slowly, sometimes avoided entirely during the coldest nights. Another mainstream observation from archaeological studies is that many Arctic tools were designed to interact directly with landscape features. Snow knife-shaped blocks, ice chisels tested thickness, sleds distributed weight across fragile surfaces. None of these tools function well without understanding the land they engage with. Tools alone are not enough. You feel the emotional weight of this environment pressing in quietly. There is no sense of dominance here, no illusion that technology will solve everything. Even the most skilled individuals move humbly. Confidence exists, but it is tempered. Overconfidence is punished swiftly. Children learn this lesson early. They are not shielded from the land, but introduced gradually. Small trips, short distances, constant supervision that looks casual but is absolute. They learn when not to step long before they learn why. The land enforces consistency in teaching. Mistakes are not tolerated by physics. There is a strange comfort in this clarity. The rules are harsh, but they are stable. If you respect them, the land allows you to pass. If you ignore them, it does not negotiate. This predictability becomes a form of security. You begin to feel how survival here is less about battling cold and more about navigating complexity. Every choice interacts with terrain, weather, and time. Nothing exists in isolation. The land remembers what you did yesterday. Tracks remain. Disturbances linger. Your presence leaves evidence. As night approaches, shadows deepen across uneven ground, familiar shapes blur, the land becomes harder to read visually, so you rely more on memory. You walk paths already traced. You step where others stepped safely before. This is not tradition for tradition's sake. It is risk management refined over generations. Standing still, you sense the quiet authority of the Arctic beneath you. It does not threaten. It does not welcome. It simply exists waiting to see whether you have learned enough to remain. And as you move forward into the lengthening night, you realize that survival here begins with listening. Not to words, but to the land itself. By the time you understand the land, your attention turns inward toward what rests directly against your skin. Clothing here is not decoration or identity first. It is shelter in motion. As you adjust layers around your shoulders and arms, you realize that what you're wearing matters as much as any structure you will sleep inside later, sometimes more. It's broadly accepted among researchers that Arctic clothing systems were among the most sophisticated thermal solutions developed before industrial materials. This was not accidental. People here did not dress for brief exposure. They dressed to live inside cold for entire days, nights, seasons. Clothing replaced walls. Seams replaced doorways. Every fold had purpose. You feel how weight is distributed carefully. Nothing pulls or gaps when you move. Sleeves extend far enough to overlap gloves. Hoods frame the face closely without pressing. There are no open edges where wind can sneak in. The cold looks for weaknesses constantly. Clothing denies it easy access. Fur faces inward. That detail surprises many people the first time they hear it. Instead of wearing fur outward like a showpiece, Arctic garments often place the soft underfur against the skin. This traps air close to the body, forming a stable pocket of warmth. The outer surface faced abrasion, snow and wind. Comfort stayed inside where it mattered. An overlooked detail in early ethnographic notes mentions that experienced seamstresses could feel weak points in a garment by touch alone, running fingers along seams in low light. They repaired clothing before damage became visible. A tiny gap might not matter in warmer climates. Here it could become dangerous over hours of exposure. Prevention was easier than endurance. You notice how layering works differently here than modern winter fashion suggests. Instead of many thin layers, constantly adjusted Arctic systems favoured fewer well-fitted pieces designed to function together. Removing layers outdoors was rare. Moisture management mattered more than flexibility. Sweat trapped inside clothing could freeze later, stealing heat when activity slowed. The cold teaches you restraint. You resist the urge to overwork. You move steadily, allowing your body heat to stabilize inside clothing rather than spike and collapse. The garments are doing their job, but only if you respect their limits. There remains disagreement among scholars about how standardized these clothing designs were across regions. Some argue that patterns spread widely through trade and shared knowledge. Others emphasize local variation driven by specific animal availability and climate. Standing here, you can feel both influences. The principles are shared. The execution is personal. You notice stitching is tight and dense. Holes are minimized. Threads are often made from sinew, which swells slightly when damp sealing gaps rather than opening them. This is not an accident. Materials were chosen because they behaved well under cold stress, not because they were convenient. A small but fascinating detail appears in some accounts describing how clothing was stored overnight. Garments were sometimes kept inside sleeping areas rather than left outside to freeze. Putting on frozen clothing in the morning would shock the body and waste precious heat. Warmth was maintained by proximity, not constant fire. You feel the clothing move with you rather than against you. Knees bend easily. Shoulders rotate without pulling seams. This mobility matters. Stiff clothing encourages sudden movements which risk falls or tears. Flexibility here is safety, not comfort. It's worth noting that Arctic peoples did not separate indoor and outdoor clothing the way modern societies do. There was no sharp division. Everything was designed to transition smoothly between movement and rest. You might sleep wearing parts of the same garments you travelled in, adjusting position rather than undressing fully. The idea of clothing as mobile shelter becomes clearer as you pause. Even standing still, you are protected. Wind brushes past without penetrating deeply. Your body heat circulates quietly. You're not warm in the modern sense, but you are stable. Stability is survival. Some researchers continue to debate whether mastery of clothing systems matters more than shelter construction during Arctic nights. The question remains unresolved because both are deeply intertwined. A poorly dressed person inside a good shelter still suffers. A well-dressed person can endure short periods without shelter if necessary. Clothing buys time. You become aware of how identity weaves into practicality. Decorations exist, but they do not interfere with function. Beauty is allowed only where it does not weaken protection. This balance reflects priorities shaped by environment. Expression adapts to survival rather than opposing it. As night deepens, you feel gratitude for each layer. Not emotional gratitude, but physical acknowledgement. The clothing holds warmth the way memory holds lessons, quietly, reliably, without needing attention. You adjust your stance, tuck your chin slightly, and feel the system settle around you. The cold remains present but distant. You are carrying part of your shelter with you now, step by careful step, into a night that demands respect and rewards preparation. Once the clothing settles around you, you begin to notice something subtle happening inside it. Warmth does not rush in. It accumulates slowly, almost shyly, as if testing whether it will be allowed to stay. You realize that heat here is not about volume. It is about capture. The air between layers becomes still, and that stillness matters more than thickness ever could. Researchers generally agree that the most effective insulation used by Arctic peoples relied on trapped air rather than heavy mass. Air, when held in place, resists heat transfer. Fur fibers create countless tiny pockets where warmth can linger. You feel this now. Not hot, not even cozy, but steady. Your body heat stops fleeing quite so fast. You pay attention to how little contact there is between your skin and the outer world. Every barrier adds delay. Every delay preserves energy. The cold presses from outside, but it moves slowly, like something pushing through layers of patience rather than force. This gives your body time to respond. A small but telling detail appears when you shift your weight. You notice that compressing certain areas makes them feel colder almost immediately. Knees bent tightly, boots laced too hard, sitting directly on the ground. Compression squeezes out air, and without air, insulation fails. This is why movement is careful and positions are chosen thoughtfully. You do not kneel unless you must. You do not sit without something beneath you. An often overlooked observation in early field notes describes how Arctic sleepers adjusted their posture throughout the night, not to get comfortable but to restore loft to compressed clothing. Rolling slightly, straightening legs, shifting shoulders. These movements were slow and deliberate, done half asleep, preserving warmth by restoring trapped air. You realize that this principle applies beyond clothing. Bedding, shelter walls, even sleeping platforms follow the same logic. Insulation is about space, not weight. Snow blocks work because they trap air. Raised platforms work because they separate bodies from frozen ground. Everything is designed to keep air still. There is ongoing disagreement among researchers about how consciously these principles were understood. Some suggest people simply observed what worked and repeated it without theoretical knowledge. Others argue that practical understanding of air and heat was more explicit than often assumed. Either way, the results speak clearly. The systems functioned with remarkable efficiency. You feel how breath contributes to the balance. Exhaling into clothing can add moisture. Moisture steals heat. So breathing is directed outward. Faces are positioned to keep breath from soaking collars or hoods. This seems minor, but over hours it matters. Frozen moisture stiffens fabric and collapses insulation. Another mainstream conclusion drawn from experimental archaeology is that Arctic insulation systems perform best when kept dry and undisturbed. Frequent adjustments, modern habits of opening layers, or constant fidgeting can undermine effectiveness. Stillness becomes a skill. You learn to trust the system rather than interfere with it. You notice how the body itself participates. Blood flow shifts inward. Extremities receive just enough warmth to function, not enough to relax. Fingers stay nimble but cool. Toes remain aware but not painful. This balance is fragile. Insulation supports it, but awareness maintains it. There is a fascinating marginal claim found in a handful of accounts suggesting that experienced Arctic travellers could feel when insulation was failing before temperature dropped. A subtle sense of unease. A creeping chill that did not correlate with wind or weather. Whether this was physiological sensitivity or learned pattern recognition remains uncertain. Still, the consistency of such reports invites curiosity. You feel how insulation allows you to pause without panic. Standing still does not immediately punish you. Time stretches slightly. This is important. Panic leads to rushing. Rushing leads to sweat. Sweat leads to cold later. Insulation gives you margin, and margin saves lives. It becomes clear that warmth here is not a binary state. You're not warm or cold. You're balanced or unbalanced. The goal is not comfort. It is equilibrium. Maintaining that balance requires constant gentle attention, not dramatic intervention. Some academics continue to debate whether insulation strategies evolved primarily through trial and error or through cultural transmission of specific techniques. The answer likely includes both. Children grow up watching adults manage layers, adjust posture, choose surfaces. By the time they need to act independently, the logic lives in their bodies. You adjust your stance again, shifting pressure off one foot. The warmth redistributes. You feel it stabilize. This is not accidental. You are learning to work with air as much as fabric. Space becomes a resource. As the night deepens, the cold remains present, but it no longer feels aggressive. It feels contained, delayed, negotiated. The insulation around you acts like a quiet agreement between your body and the environment. Heat will be shared slowly. Loss will be controlled. You take another breath, steady and outward, and feel the system hold. The Arctic has not softened, but you have learned how to make space for warmth to survive inside it. You become aware of your skin in a new way, not through sensation alone, but through caution. Bare skin here is not neutral. It is vulnerable by default. Every exposed patch invites the cold to work faster, deeper, and with little warning. You keep everything covered, not out of fear, but habit. It's well documented that frostbite occurs most easily on exposed areas such as fingers, toes, noses, and ears, especially during still cold nights when wind chill is not obvious. This knowledge did not arrive through textbooks. It arrived through experience, repetition, and quiet correction over generations. People learned which mistakes could not be afforded twice. You notice how faces are framed carefully by hoods and collars. Only small openings remain enough for vision and breath. Eyelashes collect frost again, but the skin beneath stays protected. Hands disappear into mitts that look oversized, but there is logic in that shape. Extra space allows warm air to circulate. Tight gloves might look efficient, but they steal insulation. A lesser-known but striking detail appears in several early Arctic accounts, describing how people preferred mittens over gloves, even for tasks requiring dexterity. Fingers shared warmth rather than competing for it. When fine work was needed, hands emerged briefly, then retreated quickly. Exposure was measured in seconds, not minutes. You feel how posture adapts. Arms remain close to the body, shoulders hunch slightly without tension. Faces turn away from the wind instinctively. None of this is taught formally. It emerges from living in a place where small habits determine survival. There is still disagreement among specialists about how much frostbite risk influence social norms and etiquette. Some suggest that discouraging gestures, pointing, or exaggerated movement serve not only cultural purposes, but practical ones. Others argue these behaviors emerged independently. Either way, restraint is valued here in a way that feels purposeful rather than moral. You realize that exposed skin does more than lose heat. It draws attention. Pain distracts, numbness dulls awareness. Both are dangerous. Protecting skin preserves focus as much as flesh. You keep your senses intact by keeping your body sealed. Another mainstream observation from historical records is that Arctic travelers avoided unnecessary touching of metal or ice with bare skin. Adhesion could occur instantly. Tools were handled with coverings. Even small mistakes could cost tissue. Awareness extended to every interaction with the environment. You notice how even breathing is adjusted to protect skin. Exhalations are angled downward or outward. Moisture is kept out from cheeks and collars. Wet fabric freezes quickly, creating rigid patches that rub and abrade skin over time. Avoiding moisture becomes a form of skin care, not comfort. A curious marginal practice described in some traditions involved applying thin layers of oil or fat to exposed facial areas during extreme cold. The purpose remains debated. Some argue it reduced moisture loss and wind exposure. Others suggest it offered minimal thermal benefit but psychological reassurance. Regardless, the practice reflects attention to skin as a frontline defense. You feel how time changes exposure risk. Brief exposure may be tolerable, extended exposure is not. This shapes behavior deeply. Tasks are organized to minimize time uncovered. Everything needed is prepared in advance so exposure happens quickly and with intention. You notice how stillness protects skin as well. Wind accelerates heat loss. Movement creates wind. Slowing down reduces that effect. Standing in a sheltered position can be safer than rushing across open ground. Patience preserves tissue. Scholars continue to debate whether Arctic peoples perceived cold injury primarily as physical harm or as imbalance in the body. Some interpretations emphasize spiritual or systemic understandings. Others focus on pragmatic observation. What matters is that prevention took priority over treatment. Once damage occurred, options were limited. You feel a new respect for coverage. Nothing is left uncovered by accident. If something is exposed, it is deliberate and temporary. This mindset reshapes how you think about vulnerability. Exposure is not bravery here, it is risk. As night deepens, you become more aware of edges, cuffs, seams, overlaps. Every boundary between warm and cold is guarded carefully. You adjust a sleeve without looking. You tighten a hood slightly. These actions happen quietly, automatically. The cold continues to test, but it does not rush. It waits for openings. You deny them patiently. Skin remains protected. Awareness stays sharp. You are learning how survival here depends not on dramatic resistance, but on careful, continuous sealing of the self against a night that never stops watching. Fire does not announce itself as salvation here. It appears small, controlled, almost reluctant. You feel its presence more than you see it, a faint easing of the air rather than a surge of heat. In this environment, fire is not a centerpiece. It is a tool that must be handled carefully because it can help just as easily as it can harm. You notice how rarely flames are allowed to grow large. Big fires eat fuel fast. Fuel is labor. Labor produces sweat. Sweat becomes danger later. So the flame stays modest, fed slowly, never dramatic. It is enough to change the quality of the air close to it, not enough to warm a wide space. You understand quickly that fire here is not meant to fight the cold directly. It is meant to cooperate with everything else. Long-standing research into Arctic living sites shows that open fires were often avoided inside shelters whenever possible. Instead, heat came from body's insulation and careful positioning. Fire was used when conditions allowed and avoided, when it created more problems than it solved. Smoke accumulation, oxygen depletion, and melting snow could all turn a helpful flame into a hazard. You feel how the absence of fire sharpens awareness. Without flickering light, shadows soften instead of dancing. The night feels steadier. You rely more on touch and memory than sight. This is not deprivation, it is adaptation. Fire brings comfort, but it also brings distraction. Here attention is a resource. There is an intriguing detail found in several accounts of winter travel describing how some groups prefer to stop moving before full darkness rather than pushing onward with firelight. Firelight distorts depth perception on snow and ice. Shadows lie. A small misstep illuminated poorly can be worse than careful stillness in dim light. Knowing when not to use fire becomes as important as knowing how to use it. You notice how fuel is treated with respect, nothing is wasted. Burnable material is precious, especially in treeless regions. Dried moss animal, fat driftwood, even bone, each burns differently. Each produces different heat and smoke. Choices are made deliberately. Fire is shaped to the situation, not used out of habit. The question of how central fire truly was to Arctic survival remains unsettled among specialists. Some emphasize its symbolic and practical importance, Others point out how often people survived long periods without it, relying instead on insulation and shared warmth. The truth likely shifts depending on region, season, and circumstance. What you feel now is flexibility rather than dependence. You sit or stand at a careful distance. Too close and clothing risks damage, fur singes easily. Too far and the effort is wasted. There is a narrow zone where fire helps without harming. Finding that zone becomes intuitive over time. You watch how others position themselves, adjusting slightly without comment. Fire changes behavior subtly. Conversations become quieter. Movements slow. People gather closer not to the flame but to each other. The warmth shared between bodies often matters more than what the fire produces. You realize that fire supports social cohesion as much as physical comfort. A marginal but persistent observation recorded by early visitors notes that Arctic fires often burned with very little visible flame, producing more glow than blaze. This reduced smoke and preserved fuel. Whether this was intentional technique or natural consequence of materials used is debated. Either way, the results suited the environment well. You notice how fire is never left unattended. Not because of fear of spreading, but because conditions change quickly. Wind shifts, snow melts unevenly, ice forms where it should not. A moment of inattention can turn a safe setup into a problem. Vigilance becomes part of warmth. Even without fire, the night does not feel empty. Body heat accumulates slowly within layers. The shelter when present holds warmth like a paused breath. Fire becomes optional rather than essential. This realization is calming. Survival does not hinge on a single element. It is distributed across many small reliable practices. You feel how fire affects sleep. Falling asleep near flame can be tempting but risky. Clothing dries unevenly. Warmth drops suddenly when the flame dies. Many choose to extinguish fire before rest, relying instead on insulation and positioning. The transition into sleep feels smoother without sudden temperature changes. Some interpretations suggest that minimizing fire use reduced scent and visibility, which mattered during hunting seasons. Others argue the primary concern was safety and efficiency. The evidence allows room for both. What matters to you now is how fire is treated with restraint rather than reverence. You become aware of how modern assumptions about warmth lean heavily on constant heat. Here, heat is intermittent, strategic. Fire is a brief ally, not a permanent solution. This shifts your expectations. You stop waiting to feel warm and start valuing stability instead. As the night deepens, the small flame fades or is carefully covered. Darkness returns, but it feels familiar now. You are not left exposed. You are held by layers, by shared presence, by knowledge tested many times before. Fire has done its work without drawing attention to itself, and as you settle into the quiet again, you understand that survival here depends not on conquering the cold, but on choosing carefully when to invite warmth in and when to let it rest. The snow beneath your feet stops feeling like an enemy once you learn how to read it. At first, it seems only cold and unstable, something to endure or avoid. But over time, you notice how it behaves, how it settles, how it responds to pressure and temperature. Snow becomes material rather than obstacle. It's widely recognized in Arctic studies that compacted snow can act as a surprisingly effective insulator. When packed correctly, it traps air just like fur or feathers. You feel this difference immediately when you kneel briefly on firm snow versus loose powder. One steals heat fast, the other holds it quietly. That difference shapes how shelters are imagined. You watch blocks being cut cleanly from drifted snow. The sound is dull, not crisp. That tells you the snow has aged enough to be useful. Fresh snowfall collapses too easily. Older snow has structure. It has memory. People here know which snow can support walls and which cannot, and they know this without testing it the hard way. There is a small but fascinating detail preserved in several oral accounts describing how builders listened to snow while shaping it. A block that rings too sharply is too cold and brittle. One that thuds softly holds together. This attention to sound feels almost meditative, but it reflects practical knowledge refined over generations. You feel the inside of a snow shelter before you see it. The air changes. Wind loses its edge, sound dampens, even your breathing feels different. Snow absorbs noise, creating a quiet that feels thicker than darkness. Inside, your movements seem larger, slower, as if the space encourages calm. Some interpretations pull in different directions when explaining why snow shelters perform so well thermally. One view emphasizes physics alone pointing to trapped air and reduced convection. Another highlights human adaptation, arguing that shelter shape, size, and entrance placement mattered just as much. Both perspectives hold weight. The effectiveness comes from combining material and design. You notice how entrances are low and offset. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. By forcing entry from below, shelters retain warmth without any moving parts. This feels elegant in its simplicity. No hinges, no seals, just gravity doing its job. A commonly cited observation from experimental reconstructions shows that temperatures inside snow shelters can remain dramatically higher than outside even without fire. You do not need numbers to feel it. Your shoulders relax slightly. Fingers regain sensitivity. The cold does not vanish, but it stops pressing inward aggressively. You see how the snow walls curve inward rather than standing straight. Curves distribute pressure evenly, preventing collapse. Sharp corners invite failure. This is not architecture imposed on nature, it is shape borrowed from it. Snow shelters echo the forms that snow prefers naturally. There is debate among researchers about how often snow shelters were used compared to other structures. Some argue they were emergency solutions. Others suggest they were regular winter dwellings in certain regions. Evidence varies by location and season. What feels clear is that snow was never ignored as a resource. It was always an option. Inside, moisture becomes the next concern. Your breath freezes slowly against the ceiling, forming a thin crust of ice. This is expected. Over time, that crust strengthens the structure rather than weakening it. Snow transforms under use, adapting to the presence of life inside. You notice how stillness matters here too. Excess movement warms the air quickly, causing melt. Melt leads to drip. Drip leads to discomfort and heat loss later. People move slowly, allowing the shelter to maintain equilibrium. Balance replaces force once again. Another understated practice involves smoothing the interior walls. Rough surfaces encourage dripping. Smooth surfaces allow moisture to freeze evenly and stay put. This attention to detail feels almost ceremonial, but it serves a practical purpose. Comfort and safety overlap. You begin to understand that snow shelters are not temporary fixes. They are deliberate constructions that respond to conditions precisely. They require knowledge, patience, and restraint. Rushing leads to collapse, care leads to quiet endurance. The silence inside deepens. Wind passes overhead without reaching you. You feel held rather than hidden. The snow does not block the world completely. It filters it, softening what would otherwise overwhelm. As night stretches on, the shelter settles into itself. Temperatures stabilize. Your body adjusts. The cold outside remains intense, but it feels distant now, like something happening elsewhere. Snow, once threatening, has become a buffer. It holds warmth, absorbs sound, and offers space where breath can slow. You rest inside it, not because it is perfect, but because it is sufficient. And as you settle deeper into this quiet, you realize that survival here often comes not from importing materials, but from understanding what is already under your feet, waiting to be shaped into refuge. When you step fully inside, the quiet surprises you first. It is not silence exactly, but a soft swallowing of sound. Wind no longer scrapes at your ears. Footsteps lose their sharpness. Even your breathing feels padded, as if the space itself is listening and choosing not to answer back. The igloo does not announce comfort, it simply removes hostility. You lower yourself carefully, feeling the temperature shift around your face and chest. The air inside is cold, but it lacks aggression. Outside, cold presses and probes. Inside, cold waits. That difference matters more than numbers ever could. Your body relaxes slightly, not because it is warm, but because it is no longer under attack. Archaeological reconstructions have repeatedly shown that igloos could maintain interior temperatures far higher than the surrounding air without any active heat source. You feel the truth of that now. Your fingers begin to regain sensation, not quickly, just enough to remind you that heat loss has slowed. Survival often begins at that exact threshold. The shape of the space affects you in ways that are easy to overlook. The rounded walls seem to guide your attention inward. There are no corners to stare into, no sharp edges catching your eye. The ceiling curves gently overhead, encouraging stillness. You sense how this shape calms the mind as much as it conserves heat. There is a detail that often surprises people new to igloos. They are not always bright white inside. Over time, soot from lamps or cooking darkens sections of the walls. This actually improves light absorption and reduces glare. Snow that starts pristine becomes functional. Cleanliness yields to practicality. You notice how carefully the sleeping platform is raised above the floor. Cold air settles low. Warm air rises. By sleeping higher, you place your body in the warmest part of the shelter without any mechanical assistance. This is not comfort by accident. It is comfort earned through understanding. Some interpretations still pull apart when scholars discuss whether igloos were used primarily for short stays or extended living. Evidence varies across regions. In some places they were seasonal homes, in others they served as temporary refuges during travel. What feels clear is that they were never improvised casually. Even temporary igloos demanded skill and planning. You become aware of how light behaves here. A single lamp creates a soft glow that fills the space evenly. Shadows are gentle. Nothing flickers wildly. The effect is calming, almost hypnotic. You understand why evenings inside these shelters often involved quiet conversation or storytelling. The space invites it. There is a small, easily missed practice described in some accounts where builders intentionally left tiny air gaps between blocks near the top of the dome. These were not mistakes. They allowed moisture to escape, slowly preventing heavy condensation. Whether this was always intentional or sometimes incidental remains unclear, but the result mattered. The interior stayed dry longer. You feel the walls radiating a faint stored warmth, not from fire but from bodies and breath. Snow absorbs and releases heat slowly. It does not react dramatically. It remembers warmth and gives it back patiently. This creates a sense of continuity rather than fluctuation. Sound continues to behave differently. Your voice feels louder inside your head, but softer in the space. You instinctively lower it. Not because you are afraid, but because loudness feels unnecessary. The igloo encourages moderation in everything: movement, speech, thought. Some researchers have suggested that living in such acoustically dampened environments may have influenced social behavior, encouraging cooperation and reducing conflict. Others caution against drawing such direct conclusions. Still, it is hard to ignore how space shapes interaction. Aggression feels out of place here. Calm fits naturally. You notice how your breath clouds briefly then fades. Moisture freezes on the walls rather than dripping down. Over time, this frost layer thickens and strengthens the structure. The igloo adapts to your presence. It becomes more stable because you are inside it. Few shelters respond that way. There is no sense of being sealed off from the world entirely. You remain aware of outside conditions through subtle cues. Wind shifts alter a pressure slightly. Distant sounds still arrive, muted but recognizable. You are sheltered, not isolated. This balance helps prevent disorientation. You settle into position, adjusting layers just enough to avoid compressing insulation. The platform supports you evenly. Cold does not seep upward aggressively. The designers anticipated your body long before you arrived. The igloo holds you without demanding attention. It does not require constant maintenance through the night. Once built correctly, it simply does its job. This allows rest to become possible in an environment that rarely allows it easily. As the night deepens, the shelter grows quieter still. Your breathing slows, muscles loosen incrementally. You are not warm in the modern sense, but you are safe enough to sleep. That distinction matters. You realize that the igloo is not a triumph over nature. It is an agreement with it. Snow provides shelter only if you shape it respectfully. The environment allows survival only if you listen closely. And as you close your eyes wrapped in layers within curved walls of snow, the Arctic night continues outside, vast and indifferent. Inside, though, there is calm, a small, carefully crafted pocket where sound fades, warmth lingers, and the cold waits politely at the edge rather than pressing in. The air inside the shelter does something subtle as time passes. It changes character. At first it feels still and closed like a held breath, then gradually it begins to move in ways you barely notice. Warmth rises, cooler air settles. The space starts breathing without sound or effort. You sense it more than you feel it. You realize that a shelter which does not breathe becomes dangerous quickly. Moisture builds, frost thickens too fast, and air grows heavy. People here learned this through long experience, not instruction. A living space must exchange just enough air to stay healthy without surrendering its warmth. That balance is delicate and deeply familiar to those who grew up with it. You notice the small opening that allows this to change. It is not dramatic, not a window or chimney, just a quiet passage that never fully closes. Cold air drifts in slowly, hugging the floor. Warm air slips out higher up unnoticed. Nothing whistles, nothing drafts sharply. The movement is patient, almost polite. You feel how this airflow protects you while you sleep. Breath leaves your body warm and damp. Without somewhere to go, it would settle back onto you as ice. Instead, it fades upward and away, leaving the air around your face dry enough to remain comfortable. You do not wake choking or damp. You wake steady. There is a detail many people miss when imagining Arctic shelters. Ventilation was not added as an afterthought. It was planned from the beginning. A shelter without airflow was never finished. People knew this the way you know not to block your nose while breathing. It did not require explanation. It required attention. You notice how the ceiling carries faint traces of frost arranged in soft arcs rather than sharp points. That pattern tells a story. Air is moving evenly. Heat is dispersing gradually. Nothing is stagnating. The shelter has found its rhythm. Different regions solved this problem in slightly different ways. Some relied on entrance tunnels that curved gently. Others shaped vents near the top of domes. No single solution dominated everywhere. What mattered was responsiveness. Builders adjusted designs based on weather size and how many people would sleep inside. There has never been complete agreement about how much airflow was ideal. Too little caused moisture problems, too much stole heat. People experimented quietly, modifying shelters night by night until they felt right. The shelter itself became a record of those decisions. You lie still and notice how even sound behaves differently now. Your breathing blends into the space instead of bouncing back. Movement does not echo. This makes sleep easier. The mind does not stay alert, waiting for noise. The shelter absorbs it all, turning activity into background. A small habit described in some traditions involved checking airflow before rest by holding a flame or warm hand near certain openings. Not to adjust temperature, but to confirm movement. A barely visible flicker meant the shelter was alive. Stillness meant something needed attention. You understand why this mattered most at night. While awake, people could sense changes and respond. While asleep, they relied on the shelter to manage itself. Ventilation became a form of trust. Once confirmed, it allowed the body to let go. You feel how your breath deepens now. Not from comfort alone, but from confidence. The air is doing what it should. You are not trapped inside your own warmth. The space holds you without suffocating you. This balance also protected the shelter itself. Excess moisture weakened snow walls over time. Slow airflow preserves structure. The shelter lasts longer. Repairs become less frequent. Energy is conserved. Everything connects. You notice how the cold outside feels less relevant now. It still exists, you know that. But it no longer dominates your awareness. The shelter has filtered it down to something manageable. Not gone, just moderated. People who lived this way learned to sense ventilation problems instinctively. A slight dampness on clothing, a heaviness in the air, frost forming too quickly. These signs prompted quiet adjustments. A block shifted, an opening cleared. No one made a fuss. You begin to see how much of survival here depends on preventing problems, rather than reacting to them. Ventilation is invisible when it works. That is its success. Like breath itself, you notice it only when something goes wrong. As the night deepens further, the shelter continues its slow exchange with the world outside. Air moves, heat lingers, moisture escapes. You drift closer to sleep, supported by systems designed to function without attention. You rest knowing that while you sleep, the shelter will keep breathing. And because it does, so will you. Sleep does not arrive here as solitude. It arrives as closeness. You settle beside others. Bodies aligned carefully, not randomly. Space is shared with intention, every inch accounted for. This is not crowding, it is design. Warmth moves best when it has somewhere to go, and tonight it moves between people. You feel how bodies are positioned to reduce exposed surface. Shoulders touch lightly, legs angle so feet do not press cold walls. No one sprawls. Sprawling wastes heat. Everyone curls just enough to create a shared pocket where warmth can circulate. It feels practice, not restrictive. In many Arctic communities, sleeping arrangements favoured grouping rather than isolation, especially during the coldest nights. This was not simply social preference, it was thermal logic. Multiple bodies generate and retain heat far more efficiently together than apart. You feel this almost immediately. The air between you grows softer, less sharp. There is a quiet choreography to how people settle in. No one fidgets excessively. Movements are slow, cooperative. One person adjusts, another responds. The goal is balance, not personal comfort alone. You realize that sleep here is a collective act. Everyone's warmth depends on everyone else's restraint. An understated detail found in several early descriptions mentions that people often slept facing inward backs toward the outer walls. The most vulnerable parts of the body stayed protected by shared heat while layers and insulation handled exposure. This arrangement was not rigid, but it was common enough to notice. You notice how blankets and skins are layered across multiple people rather than assigned individually. Overlaps matter. Gaps do not. Coverings drape in a way that allows heat to pool without creating pressure points. Compression would squeeze out air. Air is warmth. Everyone understands this without discussion. There has never been full agreement about how much social closeness was driven by necessity versus cultural value. Some interpretations emphasize survival efficiency. Others point to long-standing traditions of communal living that predated extreme cold adaptations. The truth likely blends both. What matters now is how natural it feels to rest this way. You feel how breathing synchronizes over time, not consciously, just rhythm settling into rhythm. The space fills with slow, steady exhalations that rise and drift away through the shelter's breathing openings. The sound is faint, almost oceanic, steady enough to quiet the mind. Children sleep closest to adults. This is not sentimentality. Smaller bodies lose heat faster. Placement protects them without special equipment. Elders are positioned where warmth is stable, where movement around them is minimal. Everyone's place reflects awareness, not hierarchy. You notice how stillness becomes easier once warmth stabilizes. Muscles unclench, shivering fades. The body stops fighting and starts conserving. This transition feels like crossing a threshold. Once reached, sleep becomes possible. A detail that often surprises modern readers is how little individual bedding existed. Instead of many separate items, a few shared coverings did most of the work. This reduced material needs and simplified nighttime routines. Fewer pieces meant fewer gaps. Fewer gaps meant less heat loss. You feel how personal space means something different here. Privacy is not defined by distance, but by trust. Touch is neutral, expected, unremarkable. It carries no urgency, it simply exists as part of staying alive through the night. Some observers have wondered whether such closeness ever caused discomfort or conflict. Accounts suggest that norms developed early to prevent that. Movement was limited. Respect for shared warmth was taught gently and reinforced constantly. Disruption affected everyone, so cooperation became instinctive. You realize that sleep here is not an escape from the environment. It is an engagement with it. Bodies become part of the insulation system. Heat is shared. Responsibility is shared. The night is endured together. As your eyes close, you feel the space settle. No one speaks. No one needs to. The shelter holds. The coverings hold. The warmth stabilizes. You are no longer an individual trying to stay warm. You're part of a small, carefully arranged system that knows how to last until morning. And in that shared stillness, sleep finally arrives, not as collapse, but as continuation. Night routines do not feel like rituals here. They feel like habits worn smooth by repetition. Nothing dramatic marks the transition into sleep. Instead, a series of small actions unfold in a familiar order, each one reducing risk just a little more. You notice how these steps happen quietly, almost without awareness, as if the night itself expects them. Before settling, fully hands move across clothing and coverings, checking edges, overlaps, tightness. Not fussing, just confirming. A sleeve pulled too far back is corrected. A fold of fur adjusted to block a draft you barely felt. These movements are economical. No energy is wasted on anything unnecessary. You become aware that the most dangerous time of night is not the deepest cold. It is the transition periods, falling asleep, waking briefly, moments when attention fades. These routines exist to protect against mistakes made when the mind drifts. By doing everything the same way every night, people reduce the chance of forgetting something important. You feel how tools are placed deliberately before sleep. Nothing is left out of reach. A knife rests where it can be found without looking. A lamp sits ready but covered. Boots are positioned so they can be slipped on quickly if needed. Preparation continues into rest. There is a quiet understanding that emergencies rarely announce themselves loudly. A shift in wind, a sound outside, a structural change in the shelter. Night routines anticipate this by minimizing reaction time. When something happens, response is immediate because the groundwork is already done. An easily missed detail noted in several accounts describes how people avoided sleeping too deeply during severe weather. Rest was lighter, more responsive. This was not anxiety, it was adaptation. The body learned to hover between sleep and awareness when conditions demanded it. On calmer nights, rest deepened naturally. You notice how children are guided gently through these routines without formal instruction. A hand moves theirs, a whispered correction, a repeated pattern. Over time, the sequence becomes automatic. By adulthood, night preparation feels as natural as breathing. Some interpretations suggest that these routines serve not only practical purposes but psychological ones. Predictability reduces stress. Familiar sequences reassure the mind. When the outside world is unpredictable, internal order becomes comforting. Whether this was intentional or simply a byproduct remains unclear. What matters is how effective it feels. You feel the shelter settle again as everyone completes their checks. Movements slow, the space grows quieter. Nothing is left undone because nothing is left to chance. The night is not trusted, it is managed. Another small but telling practice involves eating just before sleep. Not a large meal, enough to sustain warmth through the first hours of rest. Digestion produces heat. Timing matters. Food becomes part of the thermal system rather than a separate concern. You become aware of how people avoid drinking too much before sleep. Waking to leave the shelter risks exposure. Balance is required. Everything is weighed against nighttime vulnerability. Hands brush snow or frost from clothing before settling in. Moisture is the enemy of warmth. Even small accumulations are removed. This tension continues even when tired. Fatigue does not excuse carelessness here. There is a rhythm to the sounds now. Breathing, fabric shifting, a distant wind, nothing sharp, nothing alarming. The routines have done their work. The night feels predictable enough to rest within. You notice how conversation fades without being ended. Stories trail off. Words become unnecessary. Everyone knows what comes next. Silence is not imposed. It arrives naturally when all tasks are complete. Some scholars have wondered how much these routines varied between families or groups. Evidence suggests there was flexibility, but core elements remained consistent. Check coverings, confirm tools, prepare bodies, reduce risk. The details changed. The logic did not. You feel your own body responding to the sequence. Muscles loosen, breath deepens. The mind stops scanning for problems because problems have already been addressed. Sleep becomes safer when preparation is thorough. There is no final gesture, no closing moment. The routines do not end, they taper off. Awareness dims gradually. Responsibility shifts from conscious action to learned habit. As you drift closer to sleep, you realize that surviving Arctic nights is not about bravery and darkness. It is about respect for routine. Night after night, the same actions protect against the same dangers. Consistency becomes a shield. The cold remains outside, persistent and patient. Inside, preparation has created a buffer. The night will still test, but it will find fewer openings. And as your thoughts slow and the shelter breathes steadily around you, you rest within a system designed to hold through the hours you cannot watch. Hunger does not feel dramatic here. It arrives quietly, more like a gentle pull than a sharp demand. You notice it most when you settle into stillness. Movement fades, the body turns inward, and somewhere beneath layers and shared warmth, digestion becomes part of the night's work. Food here is chosen for what it does after you eat it, not how it tastes in the moment. Rich fats sit heavy but dependable. They burn slowly, releasing warmth over hours rather than minutes. You feel that warmth spread gradually, not as a rush, but as a steady presence that supports sleep rather than interrupting it. People learned long ago that lean food satisfies hunger, but fails the night. Protein alone digests too quickly, leaving the body searching for fuel before morning. Fat stays. It carries you through the deepest hours when the cold outside is strongest and movement inside is minimal. This is not theory. It is memory reinforced by nights that went well and nights that did not. You notice how meals before sleep are modest, enough to sustain heat, not enough to burden digestion. Overeating makes the body work too hard, producing sweat that later cools and steals warmth. Balance matters. Everything tonight is about balance. There is an old habit described in passing by travellers who spent winters among Arctic families. Before sleeping, a small piece of fat might be set aside, not eaten immediately but kept close. If someone woke cold in the night, it could be consumed quietly, adding fuel without requiring movement. Whether this was common everywhere is uncertain. What matters is the logic behind it. Heat can be replenished from within as well as without. You feel how thirst behaves differently in the cold. It hides. The air is dry breath, carries moisture away, but the sensation of thirst rarely announces itself clearly. People here learn to drink enough before sleep without overdoing it. Waking to relieve yourself risks exposure. Not drinking enough risks dehydration that weakens the body's ability to regulate temperature. Again, balance. The body responds to food with a gentle heaviness. Muscles relax more easily. Shivering fades. Sleep edges closer. You sense that eating here is not separate from rest. It's part of the same process, one supporting the other. There is quiet disagreement among those who study Arctic diets about how much variety existed in winter meals. Some descriptions suggest monotony. Others hint at careful variation depending on availability. What feels clear is that variety mattered less than reliability. Familiar food reduced uncertainty. The body knew what to expect. That familiarity itself became comforting. You notice how food is shared without ceremony. Portions are adjusted subtly. Someone who needs more receives more without comment. Someone who has eaten enough does not take extra. This is not generosity framed as virtue. It is efficiency shaped by necessity. Everyone's warmth depends on everyone's judgment. Children are given food earlier in the evening. Their bodies burn through energy faster. Elders eat what they need, no more, no less. These choices are not debated. They are understood. You feel how the shelter holds the smell of food briefly, then releases it. Nothing lingers too strongly. Strong smells invite restlessness. Mildness encourages sleep. Even scent is managed carefully. There is a small, almost tender detail noted in some accounts describing how people listened to stomach sounds during the night. Not with worry, but awareness. A quiet body meant balance. Loud hunger or discomfort meant something would need adjusting tomorrow. The night itself became feedback. You realize that food here is not comfort in the modern sense. It does not distract or entertain, it supports, it steadies, it fades into the background once its work is done. As digestion slows, warmth stabilizes. Your body stops negotiating with the cold and settles into cooperation with it. The outside temperature may continue to fall, but inside heat production and retention have aligned. Sleep approaches not as collapse, but as continuation. Eating has prepared the body for rest the same way clothing prepared it for exposure and shelter prepared it for stillness. Each element fits into the next. You take a slow breath and feel the quiet assurance of enough. Enough warmth, enough fuel, enough preparation. The night still stretches long, but your body is ready to meet it without urgency. And as your thoughts soften, you drift deeper into rest, supported by a system where even food knows its role in carrying you safely through the coldest hours. Light arrives quietly in this world. Not in bursts, not in floods, but as a steady, modest presence that never demands attention. The oil lamp sits low and unassuming. Its flame barely taller than your thumb. And yet the moment it is lit, the space changes. Not warmer exactly, but softer. The edges of the shelter relax. Shadows settle instead of jumping. You notice first how little fuel it consumes. A shallow dish. A wick drawn up just enough. The flame burns patiently as if it understands that excess would be a mistake. This light is not meant to banish darkness. It is meant to coexist with it. People here learned long ago that fire did not need to roar to be useful. A small flame can do many things at once. It offers light without smoke. It produces a hint of warmth without melting the shelter. It steadies the mind in a place where long darkness can stretch thought too thin. The lamp becomes part of the night rather than an interruption. You feel how the glow changes faces. Expressions soften. Eyes adjust. No one squints or shields their gaze. The light is gentle enough to rest in. This matters. Harsh light keeps the mind alert. Soft light invites calm. The fuel itself carries a quiet importance. Rendered animal fat burns slowly and consistently. It does not flare unpredictably. It does not require constant tending. The lamp can be trusted to behave while attention drifts elsewhere. That trust allows people to focus on rest conversation or silence without anxiety. There is an easily overlooked detail described in several early observations where lamps were placed slightly behind sleeping areas rather than directly beside them. This reduced glare and prevented accidental contact while shifting in sleep. Placement mattered as much as flame size. Everything was arranged to support the night rather than compete with it. You notice how the lamp also dries the air just enough to matter. Breath adds moisture. Snow walls absorb some of it. The lamp's gentle heat encourages slow circulation, helping keep the interior balanced. It is not ventilation by force, but by suggestion. There is some uncertainty about how widespread lamp use was across all Arctic regions and seasons. In some places, lamps were central to daily life. In others, they appeared only when conditions required them. What feels clear is that when lamps were used, they were treated with respect rather than dependence. They supported existing systems rather than replacing them. You watch how hands move near the flame. Calm, unhurried, no sudden gestures. Everyone knows how easily fur can singe. Awareness remains even in low light. Habit keeps accidents rare. The lamp also anchors time. Without sunrise or sunset to mark hours clearly, small rituals become clocks. The lamp is lit. Stories begin. The lamp dims. Voices fade. Eventually the flame is covered or extinguished. Night progresses in stages defined by light rather than sky. You feel how the lamp's presence affects sleep. Complete darkness can sharpen the mind, making it alert to every sound. A faint glow softens that vigilance. The brain relaxes, reassured by visibility without stimulation. Sleep arrives more easily when the unknown is gently illuminated. A small habit mentioned casually in some traditions involves adjusting the wick before sleep to ensure the flame would last a predictable length of time. Not all night, just long enough to ease the transition into rest. Waking in darkness felt different when the mind was already settled. You notice how the lamp never becomes the focus of the room. No one stares into it. No one warms their hands too close. It exists to serve, not to draw attention. In this way, it mirrors many tools here. Effective because it is modest. There is quiet debate among those who study Arctic living about whether oil lamps contributed meaningfully to heating or primarily serve psychological and practical roles. The answer depends on how one defines heat. Physically, the warmth is minimal. Experientially, the difference feels larger. The body relaxes. Muscles loosen. That relaxation reduces heat loss. In that sense, the lamp warms indirectly. You feel how the shelter responds. Ice crystals near the ceiling soften slightly, then refreeze evenly. The structure remains stable. Nothing drips. Nothing shifts. The lamp works within narrow limits, and those limits keep everything else in balance. As the night deepens, the flame becomes less noticeable. Your eyes adapt. The glow fades into the background of awareness. Eventually, someone reaches out and covers it, reducing the flame to darkness without drama. No sudden change, just a return to the quiet that was already there. The lamp has done its work. It has guided the evening gently into night. It has supported rest without overstaying its welcome. It leaves no afterimage, no lingering disturbance. You settle again now, without light, but not without calm. The memory of the glow remains in your body more than your eyes. Warmth holds steady, breath slows, thought softens. And as darkness resumes its full presence, it no longer feels absolute. It feels familiar, shaped, made manageable by a small, steady flame that knew exactly when to appear and when to step aside. Time behaves differently once the light is gone for good. Without sunrise to aim toward, without clocks or glowing screens, the night stretches and compresses in unfamiliar ways. You stop measuring hours and start sensing phases. The Arctic night is not one long darkness. It moves in slow waves, and your body learns to ride them. You notice first how waiting becomes normal. Not passive waiting, but settled patience. There is no rush to reach morning because morning may be far away. Instead, you rest within the moment you're given. The mind deprived of constant markers softens its grip on urgency. People here learn to let time loosen. Sleep comes in segments rather than one long descent. You drift off. You wake briefly, you settle again. This rhythm feels natural under long darkness. Fighting it would waste energy. Accepting it conserves warmth and calm. Long winter nights reshaped how rest was understood. Instead of forcing a single deep sleep, people allowed lighter sleep to come and go. This responsiveness mattered. It allowed awareness to return quickly if conditions changed. At the same time, it prevented anxiety from building during wakeful moments. Waking did not mean failure. It meant continuation. You feel this yourself. A small sound outside, a shift in wind. Your eyes open briefly. You assess without fear. Everything feels stable. You close them again. The cycle repeats quietly. There is a subtle habit described in some oral histories where people counted rest not by hours slept, but by how they felt upon waking. Warmth intact. Limbs responsive. Breath steady. These signs mattered more than duration. A short but balanced rest was better than long sleep followed by cold stiffness. The darkness itself begins to feel thick, almost physical. It presses gently, not threateningly. Without light to distract, the mind turns inward. Thoughts slow, memory drifts. Stories replay themselves without urgency. This mental stillness supports physical stillness. Everything works together. You notice how sound marks time instead. Wind rises, then falls. Snow shifts. Ice settles with distant cracks. These become the night's signals. You learn to recognize which sounds require attention and which belong to the land simply adjusting itself. Over time, most sounds fade into reassurance rather than alarm. Children learn this rhythm early. They wake, murmur, adjust, sleep again. No one scolds them for restlessness. Movement is quiet. Wakefulness is allowed. The night is long enough to contain it. Some observers have suggested that this segmented rest pattern influenced storytelling traditions. Stories stretch, they pause, they resume. Narratives do not rush toward endings, they unfold the way the night does. Whether this connection is intentional or coincidental remains open, but the similarity is striking. You feel how the absence of light removes pressure from the eyes. Muscles around them relax, the face softens, even dreams seem slower, less sharp-edged. Darkness cushions thought. There is a small detail mentioned occasionally where people use touch rather than sight to orient themselves during brief waking moments. A familiar sleeve, a shared covering, a hand resting nearby. These anchors prevent disorientation. You know where you are without needing to see. Time continues without demanding acknowledgement. You stop wondering how long it has been. That question loses relevance. What matters is whether the system holds. Warmth remains steady, shelter remains sound, bodies remain responsive. The Arctic night does not reward impatience. It teaches endurance through acceptance. You do not push through it. You settle into it. In doing so, the night becomes less heavy. As rest comes and goes, you sense the difference between discomfort and danger. Cold discomfort might wake you briefly. Danger announces itself differently, sharper, more insistent. Experience teaches the distinction. Most nights pass without requiring action. You drift again, feeling time blur at the edges. Minutes or hours pass. It is impossible to tell, and it no longer matters. The night holds you without hurry. Eventually, without warning, rest deepens. Not because morning approaches, but because the body has found its rhythm. You sink into it, gently trusting that waking will come when it needs to. In the Arctic, nighttime stops being something you chase. It becomes something you inhabit, and as you sail deeper into that quiet stretch, you realize that surviving the coldest nights also means learning when to let go of counting altogether. Cold does not wait for adulthood. It meets you early here quietly without ceremony. Children grow up with it present in every season, shaping how they move, how they rest, how they understand safety. There is no moment where someone sits them down and explains survival. Learning happens sideways through watching and doing and feeling what works. You notice how small bodies are always in motion during the day, then carefully guided into stillness at night. Energy is spent when it can be replaced. It is conserved when it cannot. Children are not allowed to wander far, not because of fear, but because distance costs warmth. They learn this before they learn words for it. Hands are guided gently, a mitten pulled back into place, a hood adjusted without comment. Corrections arrive as touch rather than instruction. Over time, the body remembers what the voice never needed to say. This kind of learning settles deep below conscious thought. You see how play mirrors survival. Games involve balance, coordination, endurance. Falling teaches caution. Cold fingers teach timing. There is laughter, but it is measured. Play stop before exhaustion. Adults watch without hovering, stepping in only when needed. The land itself provides most of the feedback. At night, children are placed carefully within shared warmth, not tucked away separately, not left exposed. Their position changes as they grow, moving gradually toward the outer edges as their bodies learn to hold heat more reliably. This shift happens without announcement. One night you are closer to the center. Another night you are not. You feel how confidence develops, not from being told you're safe, but from discovering that the system works. Nights pass, mornings arrive, warmth holds, trust builds quietly. There is an ease in how children accept routines. Repetition does not bore them, it reassures. The same sequence each night signals safety. The mind relaxes because it recognizes what comes next. Habit becomes comfort. You notice how mistakes are handled, rarely with alarm. A child forgets to cover skin and feels the cold immediately. An adult corrects it gently. The lesson is immediate and clear, no scolding is required. The environment teaches faster than words. As years pass, awareness sharpens. Children begin anticipating cold rather than reacting to it. They prepare clothing before being asked. They adjust position instinctively. These actions feel small, but together they mark the transition into competence. You sense how knowledge moves through the group without being labelled as knowledge. It drifts, it settles. A story told casually includes a warning. A memory shared includes a solution. No one says remember this. Everyone does anyway. The night treats children and adults the same. Cold does not care about age. That reality accelerates learning, but it also builds trust. Children are not shielded from truth. They are supported within it. You notice how fear is managed. It is acknowledged, not amplified. A child startled by wind is comforted, not dismissed. Understanding replaces panic. Over time, unfamiliar sounds become familiar patterns. Fear fades into respect. As you lie there now listening to breathing around you, you realize how much of survival here depends on starting early, not through pressure, but presence. Cold is part of life, so learning to live with it begins naturally. The result is not toughness in the modern sense, it is steadiness. Children grow into adults who do not rush, who do not overreact, who trust their systems, because those systems have always held. Sleep comes easily to those who have never known nights without preparation. Darkness feels normal. Cold feels manageable. The world makes sense because it has always behaved this way. You drift again, comforted by the quiet certainty that the people around you did not arrive at this understanding suddenly. It grew with them year by year, night by night, until survival became instinct. And in that shared rest you feel the weight of generations settling gently, not as burden, but as guidance, carrying everyone safely through another long Arctic night. As the night deepens, you become aware of how much knowledge surrounds you, without ever being written down. It lives in memory, in repetition, in the way hands move without hesitation. Elders rest nearby, not elevated, not set apart, but central in a quieter way. Their presence anchors the night. You notice how little they speak now. Stories have already been told. Instructions were never delivered directly. What remains is example, a shift of posture, a slow adjustment of a covering. These small actions carry more weight than explanation ever could. You feel how memory functions differently here. It is not a record of dates or events. It is a collection of outcomes. What happened when the wind shifted suddenly? What failed when someone hurried? What held when patience was chosen instead? These memories guide behavior without needing to surface consciously. Elders remember winters that others do not as dramatic tales, but as reference points. A certain sound in the ice, a particular quality of cold. When those signals return, adjustments happen quietly. The past informs the present without being announced. You notice how younger adults watch these cues closely, even when pretending not to. A glance is enough, a nod, movement follows. Authority here is subtle. It comes from experience rather than command. There is comfort in this arrangement. Decisions do not feel heavy because responsibility is shared across time. You are not inventing solutions, you are continuing ones that have already been tested. Some nights elders wake briefly and listen. Not because something is wrong, but because listening itself is habit. They have done it so many times that sleep and awareness overlap naturally. This vigilance is not anxious, it is calm practiced. You feel how knowledge passes most clearly during these quiet moments, not through teaching, but through presence. A child wakes and sees an elder awake. Calm persists, the child settles again. The lesson is absorbed without words. Memory here is resilient because it is reinforced constantly. Every night rehearses the same truths. Cold requires preparation. Stillness preserves warmth. Attention prevents harm. These principles do not fade because they are used daily. You sense how elders carry responsibility lightly. They do not hover. They trust the systems they helped shape. That trust allows rest. It also allows correction when needed without urgency or blame. There is a gentle rhythm to how generations overlap. Knowledge does not leap suddenly from one to another. It drips slowly, filling gaps over time. By the time someone must rely on it fully, it already feels familiar. You realize that survival here depends not on innovation alone, but on continuity. New ideas appear, but they are tested carefully against memory. What works is kept. What fails is remembered quietly and avoided later. As the night stretches on, you feel protected not just by shelter and warmth, but by accumulated experience. Many nights like this one have passed before. Many more will follow. You are held within that long arc. Sleep deepens again, supported by confidence that does not need to prove itself. The elders nearby breathe steadily. Their calm spreads through the space like warmth. And as you drift, you understand that in this place wisdom does not sit apart from life. It lies down with you, shares the same cold and stays awake just long enough to make sure everyone rests safely through the dark. The weather does not belong to anyone here, yet it rearranges everything. Roles shift without discussion when the wind changes its mind. A storm is not an interruption. It is a signal that the rules have adjusted, and everyone responds accordingly. You feel it before you hear it. Pressure in the air thickens. Sound carries differently. The shelter seems to lean inward slightly as if bracing itself. People notice at the same moment, though. No one points it out. Movement changes. Someone who is resting sits up. Someone who is speaking stops mid-sentence. Attention sharpens, then settles. Leadership is fluid now, not assigned by title or age alone. Whoever recognizes the shift first acts and others follow without resistance. This does not feel chaotic, it feels practiced. Authority moves to where awareness is strongest, then recedes again once stability returns. You notice how tasks redistribute themselves. One person checks the entrance, another listens for changes in wind direction. Someone else adjusts coverings near the walls. No one gives orders. Everyone knows what to do because the weather has done this before. Children sense the shift too. Their bodies respond before fear has time to form. They move closer. They quiet down. No one hushes them. The storm itself demands stillness. There is a calm efficiency in how the group responds. Nothing dramatic, no wasted movement. The goal is not to defeat the weather, but to accommodate it. Resistance would cost energy. Cooperation costs less. You feel how responsibility spreads rather than concentrates. No single person carries the full weight. This makes the group resilient. If one person falters, another adjusts. The system does not depend on perfection. It depends on redundancy. Sound becomes important again. The tone of wind, the rhythm of gusts, ice is shifting under pressure. These sounds are read like language. You learn quickly which ones matter and which can be ignored. Fear fades as familiarity grows. As the storm settles into a steady pattern, the group settles too. Positions are confirmed. Adjustments complete. The shelter holds. Warmth stabilizes. The night continues under new conditions, but it continues. You realize that weather here is not just a background force. It is a social organizer. It decides who is active and who rests. It determines when vigilance increases and when it relaxes. The environment sets the tempo and people move in time with it. Later, when the storm eases, roles loosen again. The person who was alert lies back down. Conversation resumes softly. Authority dissolves back into shared presence. No one marks the transition. It happens naturally. You feel how this flexibility prevents exhaustion. No one stays on edge longer than necessary. No one is expected to lead constantly. The weather calls, people answer, then everyone rests. As you drift again towards sleep, you understand that survival here depends not just on tools or shelter, but on social adaptability. The ability to reorganize quickly and quietly when conditions change keeps the night from turning dangerous. The storm outside continues its work, reshaping drifts, smoothing edges, testing structures. Inside, the group breathes together, adjusted but calm. The system has responded successfully once more. And as the wind fades into the background sound, you settle again, knowing that if it rises later, the response will come just as smoothly. The weather may lead, but it never leads alone. Silence becomes something you actively protect, not because sound is forbidden, but because quiet holds warmth in ways noise never can. You feel this as you lie still, aware of how even small movements disturb the balance you have settled into. A shift of fabric, a cough, a knee turning. Each one sends a ripple through the shared air. You notice how people move less as the night deepens. Not frozen, not rigid, but economical. Stillness is chosen because it works. Motion creates air currents. Air currents carry heat away. The body understands this before the mind does. You feel the urge to fidget fade on its own. Sound behaves differently in this quiet. It does not vanish, it softens. A breath nearby blends into the shelter. A distant gust arrives as a low murmur rather than a warning. The absence of sharp noise allows your nerves to loosen. Vigilance gives way to trust. There is an awareness that silence itself is insulating. Without sudden sounds, the body stays relaxed. Muscles remain loose. Loose muscles waste less energy. Everything connects in subtle ways that are easy to miss until you experience them together. You remember earlier how snow absorbed sound outside. Inside, human behavior does the same. People lower voices instinctively. Words are chosen carefully. Conversations taper off rather than end abruptly. The night prefers gentle transitions. A small movement nearby draws your attention briefly. Someone adjusts a covering, the sound is soft, intentional. No one startles. The system absorbs it and returns to stillness. This responsiveness without alarm feels learned, not accidental. You sense how quiet also protects sleep. Loud sounds pull you fully awake. Soft sounds allow you to drift in and out without disruption. In a place where waking too sharply can mean losing warmth, this matters. There are moments when silence feels almost physical, like an extra layer settling over you. It presses lightly, reassuring rather than heavy. You sink into it the way you sink into bedding, trusting it to hold. You notice how even thoughts become quieter. Without noise to react to, the mind stops scanning for threats. Images slow, memory drifts. Awareness narrows to simple sensations, breath, warmth, weight. This quiet is not emptiness. It is full of small, steady signals. The shelter breathing, the wind far away, ice adjusting somewhere beyond the walls. These sounds are familiar enough to be comforting. They confirm that the world is behaving as expected. You realize that silence here is not passive, it is maintained, chosen, respected. People learn early that noise wastes energy and attention. Over time, restraint becomes natural. As the night continues, the quiet deepens further. Not because everyone is asleep, but because everyone is aligned. Needs are met, risks are reduced, there is nothing left to negotiate. Your own movement slowed almost nothing. You feel the shared warmth stabilize again after each small adjustment. The system recovers easily now, everything is working together. You drift closer to sleep, carried by a quiet that feels earned rather than imposed. It is the sound of many small decisions made correctly night after night. And in that carefully held stillness, the cold outside loses one more way to reach you. Illness in the cold announces itself quietly at first. Not with drama, but with small changes that are easy to overlook if you are not paying attention. A stiffness that lingers longer than usual. Fingers that do not recover warmth as quickly. Breath that feels heavier, less cooperative. You sense these shifts early because ignoring them costs more later. Here the body is watched closely, not out of worry but practicality. Cold magnifies weakness. A minor problem can grow simply by being exposed to low temperatures for too long. People learn to notice the difference between normal discomfort and something that needs attention. That distinction matters at night when options are limited. You feel how care happens without urgency. Someone adjusts your position slightly. Extra covering is pulled across your shoulders. No questions are asked aloud. Observation replaces interrogation. The goal is not diagnosis, it is support. Warmth becomes the first response to almost everything. Not sudden heat, but steady protection. Illness is treated as imbalance rather than invasion. If the body is struggling, it is helped back into alignment through rest insulation and shared warmth. Aggressive intervention is rare. The night rewards gentleness. You notice how people conserve energy when someone is unwell. Tasks shift quietly. The sick person moves less. Others compensate. This prevents strain. The group absorbs the burden so no single body has to work harder than it should. There are no hospitals here, but there is knowledge shaped by long experience. Certain symptoms are watched more closely than others. Persistent chill that does not respond to warmth draws attention. Confusion does as well. These signs change how the night is managed. You feel how sleep becomes lighter when illness is present. Not anxious, but attentive. Someone wakes more often. A hand rests nearby, checking warmth through layers. This vigilance does not feel exhausting because it is shared. No one carries it alone. Simple remedies are used carefully. Warm liquids when possible. Rest rather than movement. Protection from drafts. These may sound modest, but in this environment modest measures can be enough if applied early. You notice how sickness is never framed as failure. Bodies respond differently to cold. Everyone understands this. There is no shame in needing help. Refusing support would be riskier than accepting it. The shelter itself plays a role. Positions are adjusted so the unwell rest where warmth is most stable. Cold walls are avoided. Ventilation remains balanced to keep air fresh without chilling. Small changes make long hours safer. You become aware of how much illness management here depends on timing. Early response prevents escalation. Late response limits options. This encourages attentiveness without panic. People stay aware without hovering. There is an understated respect for the body's signals. Pain is not ignored, but it is also not dramatized. Sensation is information. It guides action. Once addressed, it fades into the background. You feel how the night slows around the unwell. Activity decreases. Voices soften further. The environment becomes even calmer. This supports recovery. Stress wastes heat and energy. Calm preserves both. There are stories shared quietly at other times about nights when illness went unnoticed too long. These are not told to frighten, but to remind. Memory reinforces care. You notice how recovery is treated as gradual. No one expects sudden improvement. Progress is measured in warmth returning to extremities, in appetite slowly reappearing, in sleep deepening again. Small signs are enough. The cold outside continues as it always does. It does not adjust for weakness. This reality sharpens compassion inside. Care becomes precise because the environment is unforgiving. You drift in and out of sleep, aware of these small exchanges around you. Even if you are not the one being cared for, the presence of care affects the whole space. It slows everything. It steadies it. In a place where survival depends on collective balance, tending to illness is not an interruption. It is part of the system. The night accommodates it the way it accommodates weather and fatigue. As hours pass, the shelter breathes steadily. Warmth holds. The body supported and protected does what it can do best, recover slowly. And in that quiet attention you understand that surviving the coldest nights is not just about resisting the environment. It is about caring for each other, when the environment makes no allowances at all. Not everything goes according to plan even here. In fact, plans are made with the expectation that something will eventually shift. A strap loosens. Snow settles differently than expected. A shelter wall softens more than it should. None of this causes alarm, it causes adjustment. You feel how improvisation works best when it is calm. Sudden reactions waste energy. Careful responses preserve it. When something feels off, people pause first. They listen, they touch, they assess quietly before acting. This moment of stillness often prevents a small problem from becoming a larger one. You notice how tools are used creatively rather than rigidly. A piece of bone becomes a wedge. A strap is repurposed as a tie. Snow blocks are reshaped rather than replaced. Nothing is considered single use. Everything carries potential beyond its original role. Mistakes are not hidden. They are absorbed. If something fails, the response is not blame but correction. The goal is always to restore balance quickly and with minimal disturbance. Overreaction creates more problems than the original issue ever did. You feel how experience changes perception. What might look like a crisis to an outsider registers here as a familiar inconvenience. The difference lies in expectation. People expect systems to need occasional adjustment. They build flexibility into everything. There is a quiet confidence in knowing that solutions exist even if they are not obvious yet. This confidence reduces panic. Panic narrows thinking. Calm expands it. Improvisation thrives in calm. You notice how people keep materials close at hand, not because they anticipate disaster, but because readiness is efficient. A spare piece of cord, extra snow blocks near the entrance, nothing excessive, just enough to adapt. Sometimes the solution is to do less rather than more. A draft appears. Instead of building more structure, people reposition themselves. Body placement becomes insulation. Human warmth fills the gap where material failed. This kind of adjustment feels intuitive once you have seen it work. You feel how the group responds together. One person notices, another confirms, a third assists. Roles emerge naturally without discussion. The problem is addressed, then attention returns to rest. The night resumes its rhythm. There are memories of nights when improvisation mattered deeply. Not told loudly, but remembered. A shelter reinforced at the right moment. A route changed just in time. These memories do not linger as fear. They linger as trust in adaptability. You realize that rigidity would be dangerous here. Conditions change too often. Systems that cannot bend break quickly. Everything is designed to tolerate variation. Clothing adjusts, shelter shifts, routines flex. You feel how this mindset extends inward. When you wake colder than expected, you do not panic. You adjust layers. You change position. You wait. The body recalibrates. Trust replaces urgency. Improvisation also means knowing when not to act. Some issues resolve themselves if left alone. Snow settles, wind changes, the shelter stabilizes. Acting too soon can interfere with natural correction. You notice how patience becomes a tool as important as any object. Waiting conserves energy and preserves clarity. Not every problem needs immediate resolution. Recognizing which ones do is part of survival. As the night continues, small adjustments happen and fade from memory. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth retelling loudly. The system holds because it can change. You drift again toward rest, comforted by the knowledge that perfection is not required. Awareness is, flexibility is. The night allows survival not to those who plan for every outcome, but to those who remain responsive when plans shift. And as you settle, you feel how adaptability itself becomes a kind of shelter, wrapping around you quietly, ready to respond whenever the cold tried to pull. Travel at night happens only when there is no other choice. You feel this instinctively now, even without being told. Darkness hides depth, snow erases familiar shapes, distance becomes harder to judge, the land feels flatter than it is, and that illusion alone can lead you somewhere you did not intend to go. When movement does happen, after night has settled fully, it is slow and deliberate. No one rushes. Routes are chosen for familiarity rather than speed. The body remembers where the ground dips, where ice thins, where wind cuts hardest. Memory replaces visibility. You notice how preparation shifts when night travel cannot be avoided. Clothing is checked again, not because something changed, but because the margin for error has narrowed. Tools are repositioned so they can be reached without looking. Hands know where everything is by feel alone. The night changes how sound is used. Voices drop to murmurs. Instructions are brief. Everyone listens more than they speak. Footsteps become communication. You learn to recognize the rhythm of someone ahead, slowing down, stopping, signaling caution without words. There is a strange clarity that arrives when visibility disappears. Attention narrows, distractions fall away. You focus on what is directly in front of you and nothing else. This focus conserves energy and prevents panic. Thinking too far ahead wastes warmth. You feel how the group stays closer together than during daylight travel. Distance magnifies risk. Closeness shares it. If someone stumbles, another is already near. No one moves out of reach. This closeness feels protective rather than restrictive. Sometimes the safest choice is to stop entirely. You sense when movement would introduce more danger than stillness. Waiting becomes action. The cold continues, but it is known. Unknown terrain is worse. You notice how the land sounds different at night. Ice creaks more clearly. Snow shifts audibly under pressure. These sounds guide movement when sight cannot. Your feet listen as much as your ears. The night discourages unnecessary travel, and that lesson shapes daily decisions long before darkness arrives. People plan to avoid being caught between places after sunset. Camps are set earlier. Routes are shortened. Night travel becomes rare because it is respected. When it does occur, it feels purposeful. There is no wandering. Every step has intention. The group moves as one body adjusting pace together, or one pulls ahead and no one lags behind. You feel the relief when shelter appears again, even if it is temporary. A drifted bank, a low ridge, a place where wind breaks just enough. Movement slows then stops. The body exhales. The night releases you only when it has to. You learn to accept its terms rather than challenge them. Travel becomes something you negotiate carefully, not something you assume you can always do. As you settle, again, you understand why nighttime movement was avoided whenever possible. Not because it was impossible, but because it demanded too much attention, too much energy, too much risk. Rest is often the wiser choice. And as stillness returns, the night feels less like an obstacle and more like a boundary, one that teaches you where to stop as clearly as where to go. When the night grows long enough, practical knowledge alone no longer fills every quiet space. Warmth and shelter hold the body, but the mind still wanders. In those moments, belief settles in, not as doctrine, but as companionship. You feel it now in the way people speak more softly, in the pauses between words, in the shared understanding that some things do not need explanation to be useful. Stories emerge without ceremony, not formal tales meant to instruct, but familiar narratives that drift through the shelter like a breath. They are told in fragments, a remembered place, an ancestor who listened closely and survived. A warning folded into humour. These stories do not demand attention. They offer reassurance, reminding everyone that others have endured nights like this before. You notice how belief does not compete with observation here. It runs alongside it. People still watch the wind, they still adjust layers, but they also speak to the night as if it can hear them, not because they expect an answer, but because acknowledging it reduces fear. The cold feels less anonymous when addressed. There are moments when silence deepens and someone hums quietly. Not a song meant for performance, just a low sound that fills the space gently. The vibration travels through bodies resting close together, creating a sense of connection that words would interrupt. The sound fades on its own, leaving calm behind. You sense how belief here is shaped by the environment. It does not promise rescue or transformation. It offers continuity, the idea that the land remembers you as you remember it. that survival is noticed even if by nothing more than memory itself. This thought steadies the mind when darkness stretches too far to see its end. Objects carry meaning beyond their function. A carved handle, a worn tool passed down. These items are not worshipped but respected. They represent nights already survived. Holding them connects the present to those past successes. Confidence grows quietly from that connection. You feel how rituals remain small. A brief gesture before sleep, a whispered phrase. These actions do not ask for control over the cold, they acknowledge coexistence with it. The night is not an enemy to defeat, it is a presence to endure alongside. Children absorb this atmosphere naturally. They listen without being told to listen. They feel calm before they understand why. Belief enters them through tone and rhythm rather than instruction. Later they will remember the feeling more clearly than the words. There is comfort in the idea that the night has patterns beyond weather, that it moves in cycles, that darkness eventually loosens its grip. These thoughts are not argued or proven, they are felt. And feeling is enough when logic has already done its work. You notice how fear is addressed indirectly. No one says do not be afraid. Instead, someone mentions how quiet the shelter feels, or how steady the wind has become. Attention shifts, fear loses its focus. Some nights belief takes the form of gratitude, for the shelter holding, for warmth shared, for breath moving easily. Gratitude does not demand expression, it rests quietly in the body, easing tension. You sense how this spiritual layer does not distract from vigilance, it supports it. Calm minds notice changes more clearly. Panic dulls perception. Belief softens edges without blurring awareness. As the night continues, thoughts drift toward those not present. Others travelling, others resting elsewhere. The sense of connection extends beyond the shelter. You feel part of something larger than this single night, and that perspective lightens the weight of time. Sleep comes more easily when the mind feels held. Belief provides that holding when darkness might otherwise feel empty. It fills the quiet with meaning without noise. You drift comforted not by certainty but by continuity. The cold remains, the night remains. But so does the knowledge that others have rested here before, trusting the same small rituals to carry them through. And as you settle deeper into rest, belief stays nearby, not demanding attention, just present like a steady companion through the longest hours, reminding you that endurance has always been shared. Animals are never far from your thoughts here, even when you cannot see or hear them. Their presence is felt more than observed, woven into decisions that feel instinctive now. You notice how the night seems shaped by lives moving beyond the shelter, enduring the same cold without walls or fire. That awareness carries quiet lessons. You remember how tracks told stories earlier in the day, a path pressed deep into snow, a turn taken sharply, a place where movement slowed. Animals reveal how to live with the land by showing what they avoid and what they seek. You learn by paying attention, not by chasing. Some creatures rest with the wind at their backs. Others burrow where snow piles deepest. You notice these patterns over time. Shelters are placed with similar logic. Windbreaks are chosen where animals also pause. Survival strategies echo across species without needing translation. There are nights when distant movement catches your ear. A soft crunch, a brief scrape. The sound does not alarm you. It informs you. Animals move when conditions allow. Their activity suggests stability rather than danger. When the land grows too harsh, even wildlife stills itself. You sense how respect replaces fear. Animals are not seen as threats in the night. They are neighbours enduring parallel struggles. Observing them sharpens judgment. If they conserve energy, so do you. If they retreat, you pause. The warmth of animal bodies has shaped human thinking for generations. Furs do more than insulate. They carry the memory of how that warmth was once held. You feel this connection without needing to name it. Clothing becomes a continuation of animal strategy rather than a barrier between species. You notice how hunting stories are told differently at night, not as triumphs but as exchanges. Gratitude replaces boasting. Taking a life is remembered alongside the warmth it provided through nights like this one. Balance matters. Nothing is separate. Children learn animal behavior before they learn explanation. They watch, they imitate, they notice where animals rest and where they do not. Those observations guide later decisions without conscious recall. Knowledge settles quietly. There are moments when you imagine how animals perceive the same night, their senses tuned differently, their bodies built for constant exposure. This thought does not diminish human effort, it reframes it. Humans survive here not by outcompeting animals, but by learning from them. You feel how patience mirrors animal stillness. Resting saves energy. Waiting reduces risk. The night rewards those who move only when necessary. Animals have always known this. Humans learned it by watching closely. Even the shelter reflects this influence. Low profiles, rounded forms, minimal openings. These shapes resemble burrows and dens more than buildings. Comfort emerges from imitation rather than invention. As you lie still, you sense the land continuing its quiet exchange of lives. Some sleep, some move, some endure the night awake. This shared rhythm reduces isolation. You're not alone in the dark. Many others are navigating it alongside you. Sleep deepens with that awareness. The mind relaxes when it recognizes patterns older than memory. The night becomes familiar rather than threatening. You drift, held by warmth shaped in part by animal wisdom. The cold remains unchanged, but your relationship to it feels steadier. You rest knowing that survival here has always depended on paying attention to those who endure without complaint. And as the shelter breathes softly around you, you settle deeper into a night that feels shared across species, across generations, across the long quiet hours until rest carries you through. Once more, mistakes are not remembered here as sharp failures. They soften over time, turning into reference points rather than regrets. You feel their presence in small adjustments that no one announces. A hand pauses before placing weight. A root bends slightly away from where it once went straight. These changes carry memory without carrying blame. You sense that errors are expected, not welcomed but anticipated. Living in this cold means accepting that no system is perfect, no preparation complete. What matters is how quickly imbalance is noticed and corrected. The night allows little room for denial. You notice how stories of past mistakes are shared without urgency. They surface casually folded into conversation the way weather observations are. Someone mentions a night when snow behaved differently than expected. Another recalls a shelter that softened too quickly. The tone is calm. The lesson is clear without being spelled out. These memories do not frighten children. They ground them. Mistakes are presented as part of learning, not as warnings meant to intimidate. Fear would cloud judgment. Familiarity sharpens it. You feel how correction happens quietly in the present moment. If something feels wrong, it is adjusted without explanation. Others notice and follow. Over time, the group moves away from what failed and toward what holds. The process feels organic rather than deliberate. There is an understanding that perfection would be dangerous. Rigid systems shatter when conditions shift. Flexible ones absorb error and survive. This mindset extends to people as much as shelters. Fatigue is accounted for. Misjudgment is expected. Support appears where needed. You notice how humility lives in these corrections. No one claims certainty. Decisions are provisional. The land always has the final say. Respect for that fact keeps egos small and attention sharp. Sometimes mistakes leave marks, a scar on a hand, a repaired seam. These are not hidden. They are visible reminders that learning happened. They do not invite sympathy, they invite awareness. You feel how the night itself reinforces this approach. Cold reacts immediately to error. Warmth fades, discomfort appears. The feedback is direct and honest. There is no need for harsh words when the environment responds so clearly. As you rest now, you benefit from countless small corrections made by others before you. You are surrounded by systems shaped by remembered error. Every overlap, every placement, every routine carries the imprint of nights when something did not work and was quietly improved. You sense gratitude for those lessons, even if you do not know their stories fully. Survival here is cumulative. Each generation inherits not just success but refinement. The night feels steadier because of this accumulated learning. You trust the shelter not because it is flawless, but because it has been adjusted repeatedly. It has failed in small ways and been corrected. That history makes it reliable. Sleep comes more easily when you accept that nothing needs to be perfect, only responsive, only attentive. The system around you does not demand vigilance every second because it has learned how to recover. You drift again, comforted by the idea that mistakes do not end survival here. They guide it. They shape habits gently, persistently, until even error becomes part of what keeps you warm. And as the night continues its quiet test, you rest within solutions, built not from certainty but from patience, memory, and the willingness to adjust when the cold points something out. Some shelters are meant to last. Others are meant to move. You feel the difference immediately, even before anyone says a word. A temporary shelter carries a lighter attention. It is careful but not invested. It holds just long enough to serve its purpose, then releases you back into motion. You notice how materials change when permanence is not the goal. Less shaping, fewer refinements. Snow blocks are stacked efficiently rather than sculpted. Skins are draped, not fitted. The structure is sound, but it does not invite attachment. It exists to answer a need, not to become a place. Mobility shapes everything here. The land is wide, resources shift weather. Rearranges priorities without warning. Staying in one spot too long can be as risky as moving too often. You learn to read when it is time to remain and when it is time to go. Temporary shelter makes that decision easier. You feel how effort is measured differently. When a shelter will be abandoned soon, energy is saved for travel rather than comfort. Corners are not smoothed. Interior walls remain rough. The focus stays on warmth and safety, nothing more. Excess refinement would be waste. There is a quiet freedom in this approach. Knowing you will not stay allows you to rest without clinging. You sleep, you recover, you move on. The shelter does not demand maintenance beyond what is necessary. It asks only that you respect its limits. You notice how people pack with departure in mind. Nothing is set down without a plan for picking it up again. Items remain grouped. Tools stay accessible. The night is used to rest, not to settle in deeply. Even sleep feels lighter, ready to shift if needed. Temporary shelters also change social rhythms. Conversation is shorter. Silence arrives earlier. Everyone understands that rest is preparation for movement. The night is a pause rather than a chapter. You feel how familiarity with impermanence reduces anxiety. There is no illusion of control through construction. The shelter is enough, not perfect. That acceptance prevents disappointment. It keeps attention flexible. Sometimes these shelters are built quickly under pressure. Weather turns. Travel slows. A place to stop becomes necessary. In those moments, speed matters more than elegance. Snow is shaped rapidly, skins are secured tightly, the structure holds because it needs to, not because it looks finished. You sense how skill reveals itself most clearly here. Anyone can take time when time is available. Working efficiently under constraint shows understanding. Temporary shelters reflect that understanding directly. They are honest about their purpose. There is also a quiet respect for not altering the land more than needed. Permanent structures change landscapes. Temporary ones leave little trace. When you move on, the shelter softens, collapses, returns to snow. The land absorbs it without memory. You notice how children learn this difference early. They help build and dismantle. They see which shelters receive more care and which are allowed to fade. They understand that not everything is meant to endure. You rest now within a space that knows it will not last. That knowledge changes how you experience it. You do not try to improve it endlessly, you accept small discomforts. You focus on what matters most: warmth, rest, readiness. Sleep arrives differently here. It is efficient. You sink into it without ceremony, trusting that this pause is temporary and sufficient. Dreams come lightly without attachment. You feel the night pass more quickly in these shelters, perhaps because the mind stays oriented toward morning, perhaps because the space itself does not invite lingering. Time feels more linear, less expansive. When the moment comes to leave, nothing resists. The shelter releases you easily. Materials are gathered, tracks lead away. The space behind you returns to stillness. You understand now why not every shelter is built to last. Permanence can become a burden when conditions demand movement. Flexibility preserves safety. Temporary structures honor that truth. As you rest here, knowing departure will come, you feel calm rather than unsettled. Impermanence does not threaten you. It supports you. It reminds you that survival here depends not on holding ground, but on knowing when to let it go. And as sleep takes you for a final stretch before movement resumes, you rest inside a shelter that does not ask to be remembered, only to do its job quietly, then disappear back into the snow. Cold shapes people long before it shapes buildings. You feel this in the way humour surfaces quietly often at unexpected moments. Not loud laughter, not jokes meant to impress, but small remarks delivered with perfect timing. They land gently, easing tension without drawing attention. This kind of humour does not fight the cold. It lives alongside it. You notice how endurance shows up as restraint rather than bravado. No one boasts about how much cold they can tolerate. That kind of talk feels unnecessary. What matters is consistency, showing up each day, preparing again each night, doing what works without asking for recognition. You sense how personality adapts to this rhythm. Patience becomes default. Impulsiveness fades. Decisions are made slowly, then followed through steadily. People do not rush towards solutions, they wait for clarity. That waiting feels active rather than passive. There is a softness in how people speak to one another. Not sentimental, but economical. Words are chosen carefully. Excess explanation is rare. Trust replaces argument. This makes communication efficient and calm, especially when energy must be conserved. You feel how humour often appears when things go slightly wrong. A mitten dropped, snow spilling where it should not. These moments are met with mild amusement rather than frustration. That response preserves warmth more effectively than irritation ever could. Over time, endurance reshapes expectations. Comfort becomes relative. What once felt harsh now feels manageable. This does not dull sensitivity. It sharpens it. You become more aware of small improvements. A calmer night, a steadier shelter. Progress is measured in subtleties. You notice how people accept discomfort without resentment. Cold fingers are addressed, not lamented. Fatigue is managed, not dramatized. This attitude prevents emotional exhaustion. Complaining consumes energy without offering solutions. There is pride here, but it is quiet. It lives in competence rather than display. Knowing how to prepare, knowing when to stop, knowing when to wait, these skills earn respect without needing announcement. You feel how restraint extends inward. Emotions are acknowledged, then set aside if they interfere with function. Fear is noticed, then calmed. Frustration is redirected into action. The cold encourages emotional regulation by necessity. Children absorb this tone naturally. They learn when laughter fits and when silence fits. They learn that humour can lighten a moment without undermining seriousness. These lessons stay with them, shaping how they face challenges later in life. You realise that long winters create space for reflection. With fewer distractions, thoughts settle. People learn themselves well. Strengths and limits become familiar. Acceptance grows where resistance would only create strain. As you lie resting now, you feel this temperament settling into you as well. The night feels less like something to endure and more like something to move through calmly. The cold still exists, but it no longer feels personal. Endurance this year is not about pushing harder, It is about adjusting expectations and maintaining balance. People who last are those who conserve energy not only in their bodies but in their reactions. You drift again, comforted by the steady emotional climate around you. No panic, no urgency, just quiet readiness. The night continues, and so does the calm shaped by generations of living with cold rather than against it. The outside world does not disappear just because you are inside. You feel it pressing gently through walls and coverings, reminding you that contact has never been fully severed. Wind passes, snow shifts, ice settles somewhere far beyond your reach. The night continues its work without acknowledging your presence. You notice how small changes outside ripple inward. Drop in temperature tightens the air. A rise in wind shifts sound. These signals arrive muted but recognizable. You remain connected without being exposed. This balance prevents surprise. You are sheltered, not sealed away. You sense how people stay attuned, even while resting. Awareness hums quietly beneath sleep, not alert enough to exhaust, but responsive enough to notice when something changes. This half-awareness is learned. It develops over many nights when nothing goes wrong, building trust in both body and shelter. You feel how movement outside becomes rare as conditions harden. Animals still themselves. Snow settles into stillness. The land holds its breath. This quiet is not empty. It is concentrated. It signals stability rather than threat. Inside, warmth remains steady. The system continues without intervention. You stop checking it actively. That alone allows deeper rest. Trust grows when nothing demands correction. There's comfort in knowing that even if something shifts suddenly, response will come smoothly. The group has practiced this countless times. You do not need to rehearse it now. Sleep can take priority. You feel how the outside cold becomes less relevant the longer you rest. Sensation narrows to internal cues. Breath, weight. The world beyond the shelter fades to background. Time stretches again, thoughts loosen. The night seems less linear, more circular. Moments repeat, waking and resting blur. This drift feels natural rather than disorienting. You notice how the shelter itself absorbs attention. It does not creak or complain. It holds quietly. Its reliability allows the mind to let go of vigilance. There are moments when you sense the scale of the night beyond your small space. Vast, dark, cold. Instead of fear, the feeling brings humility. You're small but not fragile. Supported systems make smallness survivable. You drift deeper now. The outside continues. The inside remains calm. Nothing demands decision. Nothing presses for action. Sleep arrives fully, not as escape, but as participation in the rhythm around you. The night does not stop when you sleep, it carries you with it. And as rest deepens, you feel the boundary between shelter and world soften. Not disappear, but settle into a quiet agreement. You are protected enough. The cold waits outside, morning will come when it comes. For now, the night holds. Contact with the outside world does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes carrying new materials, new ideas, new ways of staying warm that promise ease. You sense how these changes ripple through familiar routines, not as sudden replacements, but as experiments layered carefully onto what already works. You notice how people approach unfamiliar tools with curiosity rather than urgency. Nothing is adopted simply because it is new. Everything is tested against cold time and trust. A new material might insulate well, but how does it behave when wet? Does it stiffen? Does it fail quietly or all at once? These questions are answered slowly, night by night. You feel how older methods remain close even when alternatives are poor. Furs stay nearby, familiar shelters are still built. New techniques are added only where they prove reliable. This layering prevents dependence on anything untested. Redundancy feels comforting rather than excessive. There are nights when something unfamiliar performs well. Warmth holds longer. Preparation takes less effort. Those nights are remembered. The change is noted quietly. Other nights reveal weaknesses. Moisture builds unexpectedly. Materials behave differently under pressure. Those lessons are remembered too. You sense how adaptation happens without abandoning identity. New tools do not erase old knowledge. They sit alongside it. The night still demands attention, still rewards patience, and still punishes carelessness. No material changes that. You notice how conversation shifts when new methods are discussed. There is interest but also restraint. No one argues loudly. Experience speaks louder than opinion. Time becomes the judge. You feel how survival here has always been cumulative. Knowledge stacks. It does not replace itself abruptly. What endures is what continues to work when conditions are hardest. As you rest now, you feel this balance holding. Old systems still support you. New possibilities remain available but unproven. The night feels the same as it always has. Cold, steady, indifferent. You drift with the understanding that change here never arrives as a rescue. It arrives as a tool to be tested carefully, respectfully, and without haste. And as sleep deepens, you rest inside a world that knows how to absorb new ideas without losing the ones that have already carried it through countless cold nights. The night loosens its grip slowly, not with light, not with warmth, but with familiarity. You feel it in your body before anything outside changes. Muscles hold warmth more easily. Breathing feels less deliberate. The cold has not retreated, but it has lost some authority over your attention. You notice how experience has shifted your relationship with the night itself. What once felt heavy now feels navigable. Sounds no longer startle. Stillness no longer feels tense. Even the darkness seems softer, as if it recognizes you as something that belongs within it rather than something to test relentlessly. The systems around you continue to work without effort. Shelter holds, insulation stays balanced. Shared warmth remains steady. None of this feels remarkable anymore. That is the point. Survival becomes unremarkable when it is done well. You sense how fear fades, not because danger is gone, but because understanding has replaced uncertainty. The night is no longer an unknown opponent. It is a known environment with patterns you recognize. That recognition is calming in a way comfort alone could never be. You feel gratitude for small things, not dramatic thankfulness, just quiet acknowledgement. For hands that adjusted coverings earlier, for habits that prevented mistakes, for knowledge that arrived through repetition rather than instruction. The cold remains outside, persistent and impartial, but it feels less personal now. It no longer presses on your thoughts. It exists and you exist alongside of it, both following familiar rules. Sleep deepens again, heavier, this time more complete. Your body trusts the systems fully now. There is nothing left to manage consciously. Everything that needed attention has already received it. You drift not towards an ending, but into continuation. The night still has hours left, but they no longer feel demanding. They feel occupied, filled with steady breathing, stable warmth and shared rest. And as the coldest stretch of darkness passes quietly overhead, you remain held within knowledge, refined over countless nights like this one. Your breathing slows even more now. Each inhale feels unforced. Each exhale drifts away without effort. The shelter around you feels distant, almost abstract, as if it no longer needs to be noticed to do its work. Thoughts arrive less clearly, then begin to thin. Images soften at the edges. Memory loosens its grip. The night no longer needs to be understood. It simply exists, and that's enough. You feel the warmth you have built not as heat, but as stability. A steady presence that does not fluctuate or demand attention. Your body settles deeper into it, trusting completely. The sounds around you blend into one continuous hush. Wind far away, breath nearby, the faint settling of snow. None of it calls for a response. Everything sounds exactly as it should. Time stretches, then fades. There is no need to measure it. The night will continue on its own, and you will rest within it. Nothing important will be missed by letting go now. Your muscles soften fully. Jaw loosens, shoulders above sink. Even the small effort of holding awareness begins to dissolve. Rest takes over naturally. You're safe enough, warm enough, prepared enough. The cold can remain outside, no longer need your attention. Sleep deepens slow and unbroken, carrying you gently through the remaining hours of darkness toward whatever light eventually comes. Sweet dreams,